When I was about 4 or 5 months old, a baby, I had a nanny who used to force feed me. I was a small baby and had some medical issues already in the past. I assume because of my small size and some cultural differences, my first nanny Charity probably thought I needed to be fattened up. She didn't last long after my mum found out that she was force feeding me, of course, and she faded into unknown history. I didn't know about this until a few months ago when my mum told me about it, coincidentally around the time where I was making progress in my eating disorder recovery. It was a missing puzzle piece in a lifetime of my strange and confusing relationship with food that made sense. There are many other things, emotional and physical, that contributed to my eating disorder, but this locked away subconscious and pre-verbal memory, this trauma that my inner child went through at 4 months old, gave me the necessary information and tools to begin to manage my eating from a place of disorder to balance and peace with food, because it finally unlocked my compassion. There are many other stories and memories locked away inside all of us that hold the information that tells us why we are the way we are. And the child who went through these things is also still a part of us, because those memories and the way they were metabolized with our infant and adolescent understanding still exist in our subconscious today, influencing the way we live. Not only the memories, but the emotions and feelings that come with it. The term inner child has been so overused in popular culture now, and honestly, it's made it kind of cringe. It's taken all of its meaning and value away, and nothing infuriates me more because it's trivialized a very important and necessary recovery tool and has turned it into a gimmick. So I have to ask you to lay those preconceptions of inner child work aside. It's not some woo-woo baby talking nonsense, it's a lot deeper than that. If you truly hate yourself, you can't afford to avoid this because it's cringe or overdone online. This is your life we're talking about, and a life you're trying to learn to live well. That means doing what works, even if it's not the most sensible, serious, or glossy as you'd like it to be. Recovery just isn't that. Recovery is difficult and vulnerable and painful, and so totally worth it to begin living a life that belongs to you and no one else. If this inner child stuff makes you feel uncomfortable, I'm not sorry to say, get over it. You always have to ask when encountering something awkward, uncomfortable, or painful in recovery, do I want to get better or not? If it's yes, keep it pushing and deal with the awkwardness of it all some other time, or preferably in therapy. Judgment doesn't work here. It hasn't worked for you in the past and it won't work in the present. So quell your pride if it's trying to rear up and toss all of this out, because the only person you're hurting by doing that, withholding important elements of healing from, is you. You decide if that's what you want to keep doing to yourself. So, let's get into it. Your inner child holds the keys to why you are the way you are, and your inner child is the only one who holds the keys to your recovery. They are the bridge between your past and your present. You cannot leave them behind. You cannot continue without them. When their presence becomes an acknowledged and permanent part of your life, that is when your recovery begins to become coherent, to make sense, to become doable. A lot of us have internal questions like this. Why every time I buy something do I feel guilty and sick? Why, if I eat too much, do I feel like I failed? Failed what, exactly? Why, when I'm in a nice place or around decent people, do I feel like an imposter? Like I don't belong here and would be better off somewhere a little less fancy? Why don't I feel like I deserve to be here? Only your inner child has the answer to these questions. What inner child work is making a connection between your past self and your present self, and using that relationship to inspire and fuel your daily life. As the gap between the child you were and the adult you are today grows smaller, what grows inside that gap, that connection, is compassion. The less distance between the two, the more compassion there is. And you cannot love yourself without compassion. And compassion requires context. Adulthood comes with many expectations. You're expected to be a certain way by the time you're an adult. Certain duties are expected to be fulfilled, and by a certain age, your way of thinking about yourself should be austere and rigid, and we call that maturity. But really, it's just restriction and limitation. We assume that as adults we require less of what we required as children, that somehow we require less help, less love, less compassion, less kindness than our younger selves did. But who decided that? Why do we think this way? Maturity is an important and beautiful part of growing up, something I will always encourage. But the societal belief that maturity can only come through difficulty, avoiding all things fun and refusing help, is damaging and has damaged many generations of adults and adults to be. Growing up does not mean you need less kindness or love. With what is expected of you as an adult, you actually need more. Responsibility is the weight you carry, the pressure, the knowledge that life is and always will be difficult in different ways, that it is inherently unfair, and everything you love can be taken away from you in a moment. Relationships are continually beginning and ending, time is always running out, and a lifetime isn't that long. These are heavy and consistent burdens of adulthood. It's strange that in the face of these grim adult truths, we refrain from offering ourselves the necessary comfort we need to come to terms with this. We withhold from ourselves compassion, and don't allow ourselves the healthy and developmental grief that is a part of growing up, nor the comfort. We tell ourselves we're much too old to give ourselves patience or time, and that needing a hug or going outside to sit in the grass, or ride a bike, or blow bubbles at our age is ridiculous. But that doesn't stop the need, though, does it? The inherent helplessness and cuteness of children allows us to access a biological wealth of tenderness and compassion that is reserved for small children and animals. Even if we don't like children, we understand their fragile state means that they need much gentler care. But when we see an adult in big people's clothes, maybe carrying a briefcase on their way to work, the thought that that same person may need the same kindness, compassion and tenderness as a baby or the child sitting next to them doesn't seem to compute in our brain. But as we've established, the very human need for love, kindness, joy, peace, etc. is there from birth, and it never goes away, nor does it lessen in intensity the older you get. That myth, I believe, has been created in order to facilitate generations of people who don't question the unfairness of the way that they are treated. Why would you when you have been told and assume it's a normal part of adulthood to be disregarded and overexerted without comfort? And any time you feel exhausted or in need of a cuddle or kind words, that you are an anomaly and childish. It's not childish to need. It's human. And we had better start acknowledging it because those needs demand to be met, and the more we refuse to meet them, the more creative we get trying to meet them in maladaptive and sometimes dangerous ways. I think rather than delving into a massive evidence-based explanation, and there are many out there I would encourage you to look into, I think the best thing that I could do is get real and personal and explain to you how inner child work helps me as simply as I can. The first therapist I ever had told me to find an old photograph of myself and keep it somewhere I could see every day. It was a strange feeling because the photo that I found was around the age where something very traumatic happened to me, and I struggled for a very long time not to blame myself. And in my adult memory, I had turned my younger self into this mature and cognizant figure that was a lot more like my adult self than the child that I actually was at the time the photograph was taken. So, seeing how young I actually was, and luckily having enough young people in my family to compare the development and behaviour, allowed me to see that my perceptions of that particular time in my life was incorrect. The picture I found was of a normal, healthy little girl. It felt strange. A lot of you can probably relate to this feeling of detachment from your younger self, feeling like when you look at photographs, you're not really looking at yourself, you're looking at someone else. There are enough gaps in your early childhood memory to make it hard to relate back to that time. That is a very big indicator of trauma. The inability to connect oneself, to look at yourself as a whole. You might relate to the feeling of being fragmented, not fully human, or feeling at times like nothing. A nothing person, a ghost. It's a very empty and deeply numb feeling. It's a place where there might once have been so much pain that a part of you has just shut down to manage it, and you no longer feel at all. The reason I'm keeping all of this anecdotal is because I really don't think that this is something that you can explain. It's something that you have to have been through to understand, and I know many people can understand this feeling, I will list some books that talk about this in detail and the science behind it, but this is a very important episode because it's your catalyst for healing. And I don't want to overcomplicate it with jargon because the message remains the same. You need to connect to your inner child for real healing to be done. So, to continue. Finding that picture showed me that my perceptions of that time in my life, of myself at that time, was off, and that I had stopped seeing myself as an innocent child and was seeing myself through adult eyes, which meant that my memory wasn't quite correct. Toxic self-blame again is another strong indicator of trauma. But I still had that feeling of not really being able to connect to who I was, to the little girl in the photograph. I felt like I wasn't looking at myself. I didn't feel anything toward her, good or bad. I think I had the same reaction as somebody would looking at a stock image or a stranger. And that was really weird to me. I didn't understand why I felt that way. Slowly, I realized it was because logically, I didn't come to terms with the fact that that little girl was me. But I had so many complicated and negative feelings about myself that seeing myself as a child, which brought up the same compassionate and understanding association I would have about children, didn't resonate with the way I felt about myself. Slowly, as I began to go through my recovery, had my breakdown, got a new therapist, and began being honest about what my childhood and current life was like, began actually thinking about not how I felt currently, but about how my younger self actually felt at key points in my life, I began listening. Slowly things were brought up like a slow trickle that began in the background. The more I started listening and taking seriously the memories and emotions that came up, instead of dismissing or rationalizing them. In therapy sessions, I'd often find myself having to explain how I was feeling as two separate categories, logically and emotionally. I didn't remember all the finite details of experiencing a broken home or abuse or any of the multitude of things, layers and layers of things that I'd been through. But I did remember my feelings, and I can only describe them as infantile. Because when I would try to access them, I would only get one-word responses or emotional flashbacks in response. Words like hurt, betrayed, ugly, unwanted, not good enough, stupid. These brief words, these feelings, bubbled up quietly from this deep part of myself that remained in the dark, often at odds with what I thought I should have felt. Who is speaking, I would ask myself, because my logical adult reasoning was telling me something different. But again, these feelings kept bubbling up to the surface, speaking out of the dark. There would be times when I experienced something that didn't necessarily bother me, but there was another part of myself that would be cringing in pain, and more words would bubble up like scared, abandoned, rejected. No explanation, no reasoning was ever given, just honest feelings and interpretations from a part of myself I'd been disconnected from for as long as I can remember. It took me a while to realize this quiet voice was my inner child, communicating out of the dark of my past in sense memories and feelings hidden away. And she was telling me her story. Not the story I'd built up for myself with logic and reasoning and a large side of denial, but the personal truth of what it was like being me as a child, experiencing life the way I did. The less I stifled and stuffed and distracted myself from that child's voice and what she was trying to tell me, the louder she became. The more I listened, I proved I was trustworthy by accepting and not dishonoring those feelings that came, proved I could be trusted with more. As I was going through therapy and drawing out memory after memory, I felt this deep pain that can only be described as grief. And I couldn't understand where it was coming from. I couldn't take it. Many times I didn't feel like it was mine. I would find myself crying for hours without logically knowing why. Gut-wrenching sobs that were coming, again, from a part of myself I detached from. It seemed that when I didn't understand why I was crying was when the experience was most healing, when the part of myself that needed to grieve began grieving. I think it was because I was finally allowing that part of myself to feel, to finally let out all the emotions and hurt that were trapped, that I had disallowed myself to feel. I stopped my distractions and addictions, so there was no longer the barrier between myself and my inner experience and emotions. I finally had the safety and the space to discuss and process what had been lost, things that had been taken from me, and the pain of years and years of blaming myself, therefore hating myself. The child in me that felt the pain I couldn't face finally had the space and opportunity to grieve. Your inner child deserves to grieve, because they were hurt and that is their right, your right, to process that hurt without rationalizing yourself out of it or forcing yourself to make it make sense. Because sometimes it doesn't, but that doesn't make the experience of your inner child illegitimate. It makes it all the more deserving of compassion and kindness. As I started understanding why certain things affected me and at what age the original wounds occurred, it was like a puzzle was being put together. Of my life. Instead of my life just being this series of traumatic events and confusion, it began becoming a timeline. That feeling of being fragmented started to lessen the more I realized that this timeline was my own. That it wasn't a series of standalone events, but my lived experiences. That I, as a kid, lived through this. And that was very overwhelming and scary. It felt unfair, because as I looked at more pictures and connected the dots between my memories and how old I would have been, imagining that little girl going through any of the things I remembered was horrifying to me. And yet she had been through those things. And she was me. Yes, I looked different, I was older now, and I thought differently, but at one point, I was that helpless child. And then along came compassion. I was beginning to ask myself things like, did she deserve the things that she went through? Does she deserve the cruelty that you give yourself now? It made me feel sick to think of being unkind to that same little girl for even one more minute on top of everything I had already been through, because I realized that little girl was me. I began to realize that if I could have compassion for her, then I could have compassion for me, because I am her. This goes back to triggers. There were some things that would trigger me that I had no context for. I just assumed I was unhinged and overly sensitive. But the more I allowed myself to connect with those feelings of the past, I realized what exactly was being triggered, and most usefully, why. And of course, that allows me to be self-aware and avoid or manage those things now in the present. Some of us don't realize how fragile we were as kids, how mishandled or undervalued. Some of us know it all too well, but we can acknowledge that our past selves would have needed compassion and kindness, a hug or a fun day out with somebody who didn't want to harm them. But we withhold that from ourselves now. Maybe because we don't look so cute, we're bigger, less scrawny looking, less helpless, have more responsibility and less time. But we have to remember we are the same person, even if we're grown up on the outside. Our body might have grown, but we are still partially that person we once were, because we are an amalgamation of our experiences and memories, and they are in there, in you somewhere. And if you weren't able to hear yourself out back then, it's no surprise there may be a part of you clamoring to have a voice now. I think one of the things that really works when it comes to loving yourself is asking yourself, do I want to be mean to that little boy or that little girl that you once were? To recognize that every time you're cruel or unkind to yourself, you are in some way being cruel or unkind to that little boy or girl, because that is you. I think of it as some sort of helpful brain hack. You find the compassion and the care for the child you were, and you're able to Uno reverse card your self-hate by acknowledging that you are that same child. So, if you don't want to be cruel to them, you had better stop being cruel to you. Or maybe it's simpler than that. A reminder we might be big and grown up on the outside, but in many ways we're still just kids trying to figure out life that's moving too fast. Remember that our inner child is always with us, still a part of us somewhere, because they were present for all the childhood milestones that make you, you. Their experience and interpretation of events influence how you live and operate in your life today. So they are worth listening and reconnecting to. The information they hold is valuable and can't be accessed anywhere else. Not only do our younger selves hold a lot of trauma, but they also hold the essence of ourselves, what we used to love and enjoy, what we wanted before we didn't know it wasn't appropriate in someone else's eyes. When we didn't know that it was expected of us to have a sensible job, to dress in grey and beige and be serious all the time. It's my belief that we are created in 3 parts: body, soul, spirit. Your body is what you're sitting in now, your physical self. Your spirit is the thing that makes you alive, pure energy, the thing that leaves your body when you die, and everyone debates where it goes. Your soul, on the other hand, it's like the mix of ingredients that makes you, you. And it's there, before you're even born. It's the unique concoction that exists inside a person, your mind, will, and emotions, your wants and desires, your unique personality and temperament, the thing that predisposes you to enjoy certain hobbies, food, or music. When you're a kid, if you had a normal and less traumatic childhood, your soul is allowed to flourish. You're allowed to sing and dance and discover, fall down and get back up again, to explore becoming who you are. And unfortunately, we hit a point where that part of ourselves is told to quieten down, to learn the way the world is and get in line. When we begin to question the contents of a soul and judge whether or not it's acceptable to the people around us, but again, that part of you never goes away. It's always there. You might catch glimpses of it sometimes when you're out in nature or enjoying something beautiful. Maybe when you walk past something colourful or see bubbles in the air, watch someone else kick around a football, and a part of you seems to stir to life, only for you to squash it back down again. I truly think our younger selves could probably answer the question, who are you, far better than our current selves could. You've seen the way kids are. What do you want to be, you ask them? A cowboy, an astronaut, a dancer, a doctor. The desires are limitless because they don't know what limits are yet. But they know what they like and what they don't like. They know what brings them joy and what they want to keep on doing, or not doing. And we silence them. As they grow older, as we tell them to grow up, and when we ask ourselves, who am I and what do I want and why don't I know? We don't consult them, the child, and ask, what was already in you back then that can tell you what you need now? What did you like doing as a kid that you no longer do now as an adult? Who taught you that the thing you love is silly? Can you imagine saying that to a younger version of yourself? Connecting to the things that you enjoyed as a child, things that made you light up and excited, give us clues to who we are. What makes a soul? Understanding our unique makeup, discovering who we were made to be, not who we think we should be. Understanding who and what taught that child that they weren't good enough or deserving of love shows you that every time we mistreat ourselves, we reinforce that lie. That initial message that was given to us that we aren't good enough. Is that really what you would say to your younger self if you could speak to them now? What would you say? It's very eye-opening to realise a lot of our maladaptive coping mechanisms come from the mind of our child selves. It makes sense if you think about how nonsensical some of them are. Can you imagine telling your younger self that the solution to their crippling loneliness is to binge eat or compulsively masturbate and watch porn until it becomes an addiction? To say to your younger self that was abused that it was their fault and they should spend the rest of their life harming themselves because of it? That they were to blame for every bad thing that ever happened to them before they were even old enough to know how to be malevolent? To the sexually abused child, telling them that now all their worth and all they deserve is partners who devalue and degrade them, who hurt and abuse them? No? Then why do we do it to ourselves now? Why do we let those desperate and childish attempts at surviving that may have served us for some time continue to wreak havoc in our adult lives? Because we haven't reached back into the darkness of the past and gotten to know ourselves, to soothe the inner child that needed it and let them know kindly those maladaptive things. We don't need them anymore. You're safe now. The habits, rules, and beliefs we seem to have conjured out of thin air, but can't let go of, the addictions and distractions and disorders, the things we think are required of us to earn more love, what they are is evidence of a child that was trying to survive. That really changes your perspective on things when you realise some of the things you are struggling with now were just means of survival for a younger version of yourself that didn't understand how to handle whatever it is they were going through. And again, what that child would need is love and compassion, not hate and criticism. Some children learn to stuff their feelings and find joy from food or substances. Some teenagers only had friends who accepted them if they smoked or drank and betrayed themselves. So now, as adults, that's all they know. So many of the things we do, so many of the things we did were just a means of survival. And there comes a point in your recovery where you have to realize that they aren't helping you anymore. The distractions, the fantasies, the binge eating, the not eating, the smoking, the drinking, they aren't serving you anymore. And I think we all know that logically, but I think the only way we can make a change is if we realize how our actions harmed and are harming the inner child within us. The inner child we still are. Why don't you deserve the same kindness that they do? Why do you think that you're not worth it? You are, because you are them. Therefore, you do. It becomes a lot easier to take care of yourself, to care and invest in yourself, to love yourself when you have self-compassion, when you don't want to do harm to yourself anymore, when you understand yourself, when you actually believe you're worth it. And I think that's very hard for people to do, adults to do who struggle with self-hate. And I think one way to manage that and make it easier is to think of your younger self, to ask yourself questions like, would I give my 8-year-old self this cigarette I'm about to smoke, or this glass of wine, and I'm about to finish the bottle? Would I feed a child I love the same food I'm about to feed myself? Listen, I'm not trying to be rudimentary, and funny enough, I'm not trying to infantilize you either. If you're an adult, that isn't changing anytime soon. I'm not asking you to suspend disbelief, nor am I saying you can't have a drink or have fun and enjoy all the perks of being an adult. You can, you should. I'm saying this is a tool that you can use when you're struggling to have compassion or treat yourself well. I'm not trying to get you to go back to laying in the cradle or giving yourself a curfew. I'm trying to help you access the compassion you need to continue on your self-love journey, to understand that taking care of yourself is just as important and as vital as taking care of a child. That what you put in your body, what you tell yourself, how you treat yourself and let others treat you, how you feel about yourself, it all matters just as much as those things mattered when you were a child. I think believing you deserve better comes from understanding your humanity, your development, and how much effort and encouragement that actually takes. For any of this to work, you actually have to care. And if you struggle to care about yourself as you are now, try caring about the child you once were, that is still there speaking to you, within you and through your memories and triggers and actions you can't explain, the child that needs to be taken care of, not hated or mistreated some more. To love yourself, you have to first make the effort to love them. We act out of what we think we deserve. Many of you have heard the quote, "We accept the love we think we deserve." You have to reckon with what you think you deserve and why, and ask yourself if that's what you want to carry on living your life from. A lot of us already know what we need to do to live a healthy life, the foods we should be eating and what we shouldn't be putting in our bodies, what we shouldn't be watching, etc., etc. But because we're adults, we don't handle ourselves with the same care and caution that we would handle children. Because of the mistaken belief, we don't deserve the same amount or kind of care. These are the kinds of questions you need to be asking yourself. Why do you give advice to other people that you can't follow? Why do you entertain toxic relationships with people you would be horrified to find out those that you love are in? Why do you think you deserve to be mistreated, but those that you love don't? We already know that the answer is because you don't love yourself, but I think when that's the issue, it helps to externalize a little bit, to make decisions knowing they will influence your inner child as if they were a separate entity, but still a part of you, and let that be the motivation for you for a while, because the more you do it, the gap lessens. The more your inner child feels safe with you, the more they bare their soul, share with you, the hopes and dreams and desires that have always been there, lying dormant and hidden in you. The more the fractured part of you becomes a whole being, like we've dealt in other episodes, the true self and the false self, or the should, could and would. I really don't think this is possible without connecting with who you once were. So this week, I want you to find a photograph of yourself, one that resonates with you, one you feel like represents who you were as a child. Find one that's cute. Keep it in your wallet or on your nightstand, somewhere you can see it often, and begin to make it part of your daily routine to see. Start to acknowledge that that little person is you. See how that feels for a couple of days. As you become more comfortable with this in your daily life, start seeing what comes up. What do you feel? What has been brought to mind? What do you feel like you're being told? When you find yourself spiraling or doing something you know that you shouldn't, tentatively ask yourself, would I treat a child this way? Separately, think about what you enjoyed as a child, that you truly loved. Try doing that or organising to do it next week, whatever it is, and see how it makes you feel. If you enjoy it, keep doing it. Factor it into your weekly or monthly routine if you can. This will help you get to know yourself and build the trust with you and your inner child back up again. These are the building blocks to build a bridge into the past and draw out that inner child that is trapped there. There are many romantic stories about love that talk about us being two halves of a whole, but they mistakenly think that means with another stranger, another human being, when really, it's with yourself, putting back together the two broken halves of one soul, so that you can get back on track to fulfilling your destiny, which will only ever be everything you were created to be. To care about the adult you are now, you have to be able to care and have compassion for the child you once were. You just have to. The things you went through, the pain you felt, and understand that your inner child still shares this pain with you all the time, that they need to grieve, and all they want is for you to listen and calm them down. Your inner child says things like, I feel abandoned, I'm scared, insecure, I feel like an imposter all the time. Your inner child is often afraid and feels overwhelmed. Your inner child is easily betrayed. And you have to stop ignoring them and start responding with love. The love they are crying out for. The love you are crying out for. For the adult you to tell the child in you, you deserve love. You deserve good things, you deserve kindness. It's going to be okay. You're okay, and I'm going to show you. None of us that were let down in childhood deserve to hate ourselves. Maybe you've done things in adulthood that make you say, well, now I have done things deserving of hate. And to that I'd say, you did what you had to do to survive, and you did whatever you knew how. Hating yourself doesn't make it or you better. Hating yourself keeps you the same. It keeps you stuck, and you owe it to yourself and whoever you may have hurt, that includes you, to change for the better, to start cultivating love in you and eventually through you. That's your true service to the world. That's what you were created for. Why you are the way you are. Why your soul is made up of all the elements that were present before you were even born. Your destiny is always to be a channel for love. The journey is finding out how. It's likely not your fault you are the way you are, and you have to truly allow yourself, your inner child, the time to process and grieve the hurt you went through. They deserve it, you deserve it. And the unfairness lies in you not being responsible for your damage, but as an adult being responsible for your healing. You're allowed to be pissed off about that too, but eventually you're going to have to realize the only adult who can be truly responsible and capable enough to give you what you need is you. That you, a safe and committed and trusted adult, is who your inner child needs. This is often called reparenting, being the parent you needed to yourself growing up, or maybe the older sibling, giving yourself everything you needed and deserved as a child to continue to build you into the adult you were always meant to be. I met someone not too long ago who carries around a small framed pocket-sized photograph of himself as a child, probably a school photo, smiling at the camera in an effort to remind himself that he is the same person, the same little boy that is deserving of compassion, that every time he makes a decision, it influences that little boy. And that is not like having an imaginary friend. I think people misunderstood or misunderstand inner child work to be some kind of bizarre role play with an invisible infant version of yourself. But that's not what it is at all. It's a reminder that child was and is you. And naturally the conclusion that comes from that is, if I can muster up compassion for that child, and the child is me, that means I can have compassion for myself. And when I struggle to have compassion for my adult self, it's easier for me to remember that there is a child in me who deserves to be taken care of. A child I once was, whose life I want to make easier. Now, when I struggle with food, and I feel compelled to binge eat, the only thing that has effectively stopped me in my tracks has been pausing and reminding myself, I never want that 4-month-old to experience being force-fed ever again. To remember that there was a child in me once who was forced to eat what they didn't want to. And never wanting to repeat something like that ever again to anyone else, let alone myself, helps me to stop. To access that kind of protective compassion for a helpless child and apply it to myself. Nothing has been able to top that in terms of my recovery, and it extends far beyond eating disorders. As many of us do, I struggle with my sense of self-worth when I'm contemplating doing something nice for myself. And I think of that little girl in the photo who desperately needed at that time comfort and attention, and for someone to just do something nice for her with no ulterior motives. Because that's what little girls deserve. I start to feel less guilty about being kind to myself, because I'm reminded that I am that little girl, just all grown up, but no less deserving of kind gestures, gifts, compassion, and care. When I'm about to do something self-destructive and harmful, I knew that I was truly recovering when one night I was struggling with an onslaught of incessant and horrible self-hating thoughts, and honestly through the fog said to myself, I don't want to hurt you anymore, and I meant it. And I could not have done that if I didn't reconcile with my inner child, and acknowledge that I am her and she is me, and I don't want to hurt her anymore. And I honestly pray the same thing for you, that you can say to yourself, to the little boy or girl you were, I don't want to cause you any more pain, because you don't deserve it. No child deserves it. From now on, I'm going to show you love. That's what you need. Don't be surprised if it's a rocky start. You have to get to know each other all over again. You have to build trust, and that takes time and effort. Patience. A lot of things can come up, especially when looking at old photographs, but stick with it. It's worth it. Your inner child is a source of joy, of vital information and hope that requires safety to be let out. That needs to be allowed to air their grievances first, to be heard and comforted before they're ready to play. I hope you get far enough into trusting yourself and being trusted by yourself that you can learn and experience that inner child joy and free, soul-affirming play, letting go of who you think you should be and flourishing in who you were and are and all you were created to be. In the next episode, I'll go over more of the things you need, but that's not going to matter if you don't start working on acting and believing like you deserve it, that you deserve for your needs to be met and to receive care and attention. Work on connecting to your inner child first. I guarantee they're already waiting. For those who have had adverse childhood experiences, including abuse and especially neglect, I would recommend the book Complex PTSD From Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker for a comprehensive understanding of CPTSD, complex or childhood post-traumatic stress disorder, and how it can affect you, and don't let the acronym scare you. It's worth investigating for yourself, seeing if anything resonates with you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast, and if no one has ever told you, or if no one ever meant it, you deserve love. Now go love yourself. As always, the episode resources and references, disclaimers and social media links will be in the show notes and description. The uncensored audio podcast episodes are available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Details on how to support the podcast are also listed in the show notes and description if you feel so inclined. If you would like access to the uncensored vodcast of the episode you just watched, as well as journal prompts and reading material, this is available through Patreon membership. Sign up to the mailing list to keep up to date with what happens next with the channel and the future of the podcast. All of this information and more about us can also be found on the Scattered Seeds website. Bye.